every few seconds faint, controlled, disappearing into the mist. His uniform is no uniform at all, just layers of white cloth, a hood stitched from old bedsheets, and a thin frost crusted across his rifle barrel. A Soviet patrol trudges forward, boots crunching in rhythm. They mutter in Russian, their breath steaming like ghosts. One points toward a suspicious snowdrift ahead. Another laughs. "Invisible sniper," he mocks, shaking his head. Then nothing. A single shot cracks like lightning. One man drops. The others freeze. Their eyes dart wildly through the trees. There is no movement, no figure, no flash. Only snow. Only silence. The patrol retreats, shaken. Somewhere in the forest, unseen and unhurried, the sniper shifts his aim again, unseen, unfindable, untouchable. And in that frozen wasteland, a legend begins to take shape, the story of the man they called the White Death. Long before the word camouflage became part of modern warfare, armies dressed for pride, not concealment. Bright coats, shining buttons, colorful insignias, relics of a time when war was a spectacle, not survival. Soldiers were meant to be seen. But by the time the First World War dug its claws into Europe, visibility had become a death sentence. The gray mud of the trenches and the black smoke of artillery made every glint, every shimmer, an easy target. The armies that once marched in color now blended into earth tones, khaki, field gray, olive drab. It was the beginning of a new philosophy. To kill, one must first disappear. By the 1930s, that idea had evolved into science. France, Britain, and Germany experimented with camouflage for artillery and vehicles. Painters were recruited to disrupt outlines with patterns of green and brown. Observation balloons were hidden beneath nets. Even aircraft began to carry modeled paint schemes to melt into the clouds. But on the ground, for the soldier himself, camouflage was still primitive, often improvised, inconsistent, or ineffective. When the Second World War began in 1939, armies entered the conflict carrying lessons from the past, but little understanding of what was to come. In the forests of Europe and the deserts of North Africa, visibility was still a soldier's worst enemy. And then came Finland, a small frost-bitten nation that would redefine invisibility. In November 1939, the Soviet Union launched a massive invasion of Finland. The Red Army, confident in its numbers, believed it would crush the smaller Finnish forces within weeks. The invasion brought tanks, aircraft, and over 500,000 men into a landscape of endless snow. The Finns, numbering less than one-fifth of their attackers, had something the Soviets did not: the terrain, the weather, and an intimate relationship with both. In temperatures that plunged below -40 degrees, Finnish troops moved like ghosts. They skied silently through frozen forests, struck quickly, and vanished without a trace. Their uniforms, white smocks, and hooded covers rendered them nearly invisible against the snow. To Soviet eyes, the battlefield seemed haunted. This wasn't advanced military science. It was simple necessity. The Finns had no resources for complex camouflage patterns or specialized fabrics. They used what they had: white bedsheets, cotton wraps, and patience. Yet it worked better than anything the industrial powers had built. Amid this frozen war of survival, one soldier's mastery of concealment would reach legendary status. His name was Simo Häyhä. Born in 1905 in Rotiavi, near the Russian border, Häyhä was a farmer and hunter long before he became a soldier. He knew the forests like an extension of his own body, the direction of the wind, the whisper of snow underfoot, the difference between stillness and silence. When war came, he was 34, quiet, disciplined, unassuming. His rifle was a Finnish M/2830, an iron-sighted variant of the Mosinagant. No scope. No technology. Just precision. But what made Häyhä deadly was not his aim. It was his ability to disappear. He wore full white. He packed snow around his position to mask his outline. He filled his mouth with snow to prevent his breath from showing in the air. He positioned himself so low and still that even trained eyes could not find him through binoculars. The Soviets mocked reports of an invisible sniper. They called him a ghost until their men began falling by the dozens. By the end of that winter, Simo Häyhä would kill over 500 enemy soldiers, many from distances where visibility should have been impossible. Each shot reinforced the same terrifying truth: he was there, yet unseen. And in doing so, he forced the world's armies to rethink everything they knew about camouflage, concealment, and survival. The White Death was not born from science or invention. It was born from adaptation, patience, and nature itself. The battlefield was evolving, and those who could vanish within it would rule it. The Winter War, as it came to be known, raged from November 30th, 1939 to March 13th, 1940. It was short, only 105 days, but those frozen months reshaped how armies thought about visibility, endurance, and the thin line between hunter and hunted. When the Soviets crossed into Finland, they brought overwhelming strength: nearly 1 million men, thousands of tanks, and aircraft. In contrast, Finland's defense force numbered barely 300,000 Benny with outdated weapons and limited supplies. But in those icy forests, the advantage of numbers meant little. The Soviets advanced in long, visible columns, dark silhouettes cutting through the white wilderness. Their green uniforms stood out against the snow like ink stains. Finnish snipers watched them from hidden ridgelines, their white smocks blending perfectly with the drifts. The Finns didn't fight in large formations. They fought in fragments, small, silent groups, using skis and the landscape to their favor. The enemy could not see them, only feel them: the sudden crack of a rifle, the fall of a comrade, the eerie quiet afterward. And in that invisible war, Simo Häyhä became the embodiment of Finland's resistance. Häyhä never sought fame or recognition. He didn't speak much, and when he did, it was brief, practical, and calm. His fellow soldiers called him Taika Ampuja, the magical shooter. But to the Soviet troops who faced him, he was known by another name whispered in dread: Balea Smrt, the White Death. His camouflage was primitive, yet perfect. A simple white suit, a hood, and an understanding of light. He knew how sunlight reflected differently off packed snow versus loose powder. He chose his positions accordingly. He studied the rhythm of wind and snowfall, adjusting his movements so subtly that even nearby observers could not distinguish him from the land itself. His philosophy was simple: the less you move, the longer you live. He spent hours, sometimes entire days, in the same position, his rifle resting on compacted snow, his body pressed flat to the earth. Even the shimmer of a metal scope could betray a sniper, which is why Häyhä refused to use one. Iron sights only, a practical choice that prevented glare from revealing his position. The Soviets couldn't understand how one man could do so much damage. They sent counter-snipers, artillery, even entire search patrols to hunt him. None returned. The Finnish strategy relied on invisibility, not just for snipers, but for survival. Every soldier understood that to move unseen was to live another day. In the dense, snow-covered forests, the line between camouflage and nature disappeared completely. Soldiers used frost to dull the shine of their rifles. They learned to move only when the wind blew, to hide when the snow fell, and to vanish behind trees with the discipline of hunters. These tactics were not taught in any academy. They were learned from the land itself, from generations of farmers, woodsmen, and hunters who knew how to disappear into the wilderness. The Soviets, on the other hand, came from cities and open fields. Their tanks bogged down in snow, their engines froze, and their troops struggled to adapt. Invisibility was not something they understood, not yet. But the lesson would echo far beyond Finland. When the Winter War ended in March 1940, Finland was forced to cede territory, but not its pride. The Red Army suffered over 120,000 dead, while Finnish losses were under 26,000 DAOs. The Soviets had won on paper, but the world saw a different story: a small nation that had turned the elements into armor, and a single marksman who had become a myth. In the aftermath, military analysts across Europe studied Finnish tactics in fascination. They called it snow warfare, but it was more than that. It was psychological warfare. Camouflage had become a weapon. By the time the larger conflict of World War II consumed Europe later that same year, the lessons of the Finnish front were already spreading. German soldiers in the Eastern Front adopted white winter suits. Soviet forces redesigned their own snow smocks. Even Allied special units, such as the British Commandos, began studying concealment as a science rather than an art. Yet among all the patterns and fabrics that would follow, none would surpass the simplicity of Hayes' method: natural, unbroken, and perfectly human. He didn't invent invisibility. He became it. Simo Hayes' greatest weapon was not his rifle, it was his stillness. To lie unmoving for hours in temperatures that could freeze exposed skin within minutes required not only endurance but complete surrender to the environment. He had learned it long before the war. Growing up in the Finnish countryside, he spent winters hunting grouse and elk, where a single breath too loud could send prey fleeing. That same patience translated seamlessly to the battlefield. In war, stillness is more than physical, it is psychological. The human body fights stillness, it craves movement, warmth, and relief. But Hayes suppressed those instincts. Every muscle in his body obeyed a single purpose: remain unseen. His fellow soldiers spoke of his composure as unnerving. He ate sparingly, slept little, and never lost focus. When asked years later how he achieved so many kills, he simply replied, "Practice." That word captured his essence: methodical, emotionless, deliberate. He didn't hate his enemy, he simply outweighted them. It's what made him terrifying. The Soviet soldiers faced not a man, but the embodiment of patience, a presence that watched, waited, and struck with surgical calm. This was the human foundation of invisibility, the ability to silence every impulse until you became part of the world around you. While other armies experimented with elaborate camouflage, multi-tone fabrics, disruptive patterns, even early attempts at reflective coatings, Hayes' effectiveness came from absolute minimalism. His rifle, the Finnish M/2830, was no sniper's dream by modern standards. It was simple, rugged, and accurate. He rejected the telescopic scope, preferring the open iron sights, which kept his head lower and eliminated reflective glass that could betray his position. His camouflage was not a manufactured suit, but a practical adaptation, a white snow smock over wool layers, often homemade or modified in the field. His entire setup cost less than the paint on a single German Panzer. And yet, it was flawless. Where advanced camouflage designs relied on patterns and contrast disruption, Hayes worked because it respected the environment's natural consistency. Snow is uniform. Any deviation stands out, even a shadow, even a glint. So, instead of breaking outlines, he erased them. He packed snow around his firing position to smooth its shape. He even built small snowbanks around his rifle muzzle to absorb the blast, so that no puff of snow revealed his location after firing. Every element of his design served the same purpose: to create nothing for the eye to notice. The simplicity of his approach forced later military designers to reconsider their priorities. The goal of camouflage was not to look clever or artistic, it was to disappear into monotony. Finland's winter landscape was a paradox: beautiful but deadly. Temperatures could drop to 40 degrees C, and the snow could mute sounds so effectively that an entire platoon could pass within 50 meters of a hidden sniper and never know. For most soldiers, the cold was an enemy. For Hayes, it was a partner. The cold slowed everything: bullets, breath, and thought. It froze the mechanisms of Soviet rifles, cracked boots, and numbed fingers. But for the Finns, who had lived in such conditions all their lives, it was the natural rhythm of war. The snow also offered optical deception. Sunlight reflecting off its surface created a blinding haze. In that glare, a man in white became a ghost. Shadows shortened, outlines blurred. Even when Hayes moved, he did so within this natural distortion, stepping when clouds covered the sun, pausing when light shifted. Sound was equally treacherous. A cough or a click could echo for hundreds of meters. The snow muffled movement but amplified mistakes. That's why Hayes carried no metal gear that could clink. Even his canteen was wrapped in cloth to prevent noise. He used the terrain as camouflage: small ridges, tree shadows, snowbanks, transforming nature into a fortress. In this frozen world, visibility was death. Only those who merged with the snow could endure. And that is what made the White Death not just a man but a manifestation of the environment itself. By combining human precision, technological simplicity, and environmental mastery, He created something that defied every conventional notion of warfare. He wasn't hiding from the battlefield, he was part of it. And the Soviets would soon learn that no amount of manpower or machinery could fight what they couldn't even see. In the forests of Karelia, Soviet morale began to fracture. Entire platoons refused to advance into certain sectors, convinced a ghostly sniper awaited them. The effect of He's invisibility was not limited to casualties, it infected their minds. Reports spoke of soldiers firing blindly into the trees, wasting ammunition at shadows. Commanders ordered artillery strikes on empty snowfields. The terror was not in what they saw, but what they couldn't. Every fallen comrade reinforced the myth: the White Death is watching. Even the Red Army's elite sniper units sent to hunt him often returned demoralized or didn't return at all. Soviet officers began issuing direct orders forbidding mention of his name, fearing it spread panic. Invisibility is power not because it hides you, but because it makes others doubt their reality. By turning concealment into a psychological weapon, He accomplished what no uniform or rifle could. He made his enemy question the very landscape around them. It was warfare beyond visibility, a contest of nerves, wits, and endurance. For every soldier trembling in the snow, it felt as though the forest itself had turned against them. The Winter War became a masterclass in asymmetric warfare. Finland, with its small population and limited industrial capacity, had to compensate for what it lacked, and camouflage was its equalizer. The Finnish army developed an entire system of tactics around invisibility. They called it Matti warfare, isolating enemy columns in the forests and attacking them in segments. The idea was simple: move unseen, strike precisely, vanish instantly. Simo He operated within this doctrine to perfection. He wasn't a lone wolf, he was a cog in an invisible machine. Each sniper became an unseen wall, halting Soviet advances through fear and attrition. Camouflage ceased being a defensive tool, it became offensive. To be invisible meant to choose when and where the battle occurred. It meant dictating the tempo of war. He's methods influenced Finnish tactics far beyond sniping. Even supply routes were camouflaged with snow-covered tarps. Field kitchens were hidden under white tents, and artillery positions were buried in ice to conceal their heat signatures. For the first time, invisibility was not an accident, it was a doctrine. After the war, this doctrine spread across Europe. The Germans developed the Platenanmuster and Herbsenmuster patterns, precursors to modern camouflage. The Soviets introduced mass-produced snowsuits, learning bitter lessons from their early failures. And the Allies? They began to see camouflage as more than color, as a system of deception, influencing not just how soldiers dressed but how entire armies moved and fought. It was the beginning of a new era, the era of tactical invisibility. Decades after the Winter War, He's legend persisted not because of myth, but because of what he represented. His approach distilled warfare to its purest form: see without being seen. Modern military technology has transformed invisibility into something far more complex: ghillie suits that mimic vegetation, thermal dampening fabrics, radar-absorbing materials, and digital camouflage that breaks shapes under night vision. But the philosophy remains unchanged. In Afghanistan, Iraq, and Ukraine, snipers still study He's principles. They learn to adapt to light, to respect terrain, to trust patience over firepower. In every modern special operations manual, echoes of Finland's snowy forests remain. Even beyond the battlefield, his influence reaches into stealth aircraft design, drone concealment, and cyber warfare, all descendants of the same primal instinct: to operate unseen. Yet, there is irony in He's legacy. After the war, he didn't bask in attention. He returned to his farm, rebuilt his life, and rarely spoke of what he'd done. He lived quietly, almost anonymously, surrounded by the same forests that had once hidden him. He remained invisible in peace, just as he had been in war. In an age obsessed with recognition, Simo He left behind something more enduring: a philosophy of absence. To him, victory did not require spectacle. It required silence. And so, his story stands as both a military lesson and a moral paradox that sometimes the greatest power lies not in being seen, but in disappearing completely. By the end of the Winter War, invisibility was no longer a myth or a trick of nature. It was the new frontier of warfare, the unseen revolution that reshaped how armies thought, fought, and survived. And for one man, hidden in the snow, it was simply the way he breathed. The cold had become a living thing. Frost clung to rifles, ice formed inside canteens, and every breath froze in midair. The Soviet offensive was relentless. Tens of thousands of troops pressed forward, determined to crush the Finnish defense once and for all. The Finns held a narrow front line along the Kala. It wasn't just a battlefield, it was a test of willpower. And at its heart was Simo Häyhä, the silent figure whose very existence haunted Soviet command. By now, his name was legend. Stories of an unseen sniper who could strike without warning had reached both sides of the front. Finnish morale soared around him, Soviet morale shattered where he roamed. He had become both symbol and weapon, the invisible guardian of Kala. The Red Army began to deploy new tactics. They blanketed the Finnish lines with artillery fire, shaking the earth for hours before advancing. Their logic was simple. If the White Death could not be found, they would destroy the forest around him. The bombardments were deafening. Trees exploded into splinters. Snow turned black with soot. But when the shelling ceased, silence returned, and so did the crack of Häyhä's rifle. Each shot seemed impossibly precise. He didn't waste ammunition. He didn't move unless necessary. When Soviet snipers tried to counter him, they found nothing, no footprints, no glint, no trace. Only their own dead beside them. He used the forest as his map, the snow as his camouflage, and patience as his weapon. For every Soviet squad that advanced, another fell back in confusion. They began firing at tree stumps, at shadows, at the snow itself. The front line dissolved into chaos. Häyhä moved slowly between positions, always alone. His closest comrades rarely saw him, but they felt his presence, the calm that followed when he took position. The way enemy fire seemed to falter as if the forest itself held its breath. By mid-February, the Soviets had grown desperate. They began targeting entire sectors believed to harbor him. Scouts reported seeing a white figure that vanished into the snow. Counter-snipers crawled into the forest at night, guided only by rumor. Häyhä had adapted with ruthless simplicity. He shifted positions after every few shots, often crawling under snow to new cover. He built firing mounds that absorbed muzzle blast, leaving no puff or trace. He used nearby bodies and branches to disguise movement. Even dogs brought to track him failed, his scent masked by frozen wind and powder. The Soviet High Command, embarrassed and infuriated, issued direct orders to eliminate the White Death. They sent snipers equipped with scopes, supported by mortars and scouts. The manhunt began. But how do you hunt what you cannot see? Each day, another counter-sniper fell. Each night, Häyhä's legend grew colder and sharper. At times, the Finns joked grimly that Kala River itself was guarded by him, that even the snow carried his aim. But behind the myth was method. Häyhä was not a supernatural figure, he was precision made human. By early March, his confirmed kills had surpassed 500, a number so staggering that it drew disbelief even among Finnish officers. Many believed it impossible until they watched him work. Lying prone, unmoving, his finger on the trigger for hours, firing only when certainty demanded. Each fallen Soviet soldier was not just a tactical loss, it was a psychological wound. Commanders rotated entire divisions away from Kola to restore morale. For every man who froze, who hesitated to step into the open, the ghost in white had already won. But as the war reached its final weeks, the Red Army's pressure grew overwhelming. Their artillery blanketed every ridge, every forest line. The Finnish troops, exhausted and starving, fought from sheer willpower. And on one bitter afternoon, March 6, 1940, the legend would finally meet the only force capable of finding him. It was not a man. It was chance. That morning, Häyhä took position near a small ridge, overlooking a Soviet advance route. The snow was thick, the air clear. He spotted movement, a Red Army squad creeping between the trees. Calmly, he adjusted his rifle, exhaled, and fired. One man dropped. Another followed. Then came the faint whistle of a countershot. A single 7.62mm round struck his jaw, a Soviet explosive bullet, tearing through his cheek and jawbone. He collapsed instantly. His face shattered, his rifle fell from his hand, and his body sank into the snow that had long protected him. His comrades found him hours later, unconscious but alive, his identity nearly unrecognizable. The White Death had finally been seen. And yet, even as he was carried from the battlefield, the Soviets continued to fall by the hands of other unseen marksmen trained in his shadow. His body was broken, but his legend was not. The bullet that struck Simo He tore through his left jaw and exited below his ear, an explosive round meant to destroy rather than wound. His face collapsed inward, teeth shattered, and the lower half of his face became a mangled ruin. His comrades, horrified but unshaken, pulled him from the snow and carried him through the blinding white toward finish lines. He was barely breathing. His pulse slowed with every jolt of movement. They thought he was dead. But even as they placed him onto a stretcher, one of them noticed his right hand still clenched frozen stiff around his rifle sling. It was as if his body refused to let go of the weapon that had made him both invisible and immortal. That day, March 6, 1940, was recorded as the day the White Death was finally silenced, or so it seemed. He was rushed through field stations deep behind the finish lines, unconscious, his face covered in blood and snow. Medics worked frantically. His left cheekbone and upper jaw were pulverized. The bullet had ripped away part of his face entirely. There were no proper surgical facilities, only makeshift tents lit by kerosene lamps, the air filled with the smell of antiseptic and frost. Yet somehow, he survived the night. The next morning, when the doctor checked for a pulse, He's eyes flickered open for just a second. He couldn't speak, couldn't move, but he was alive. And 10 days later, as if by fate, the Winter War ended. On March 13, 1940, Finland and the Soviet Union signed the Moscow Peace Treaty. The guns went silent, and the forests fell quiet once more. He awoke from a coma on the same day the ceasefire took effect. The timing was uncanny, as if his body had waited until the war itself was over to return. He would spend months recovering, undergoing numerous surgeries to reconstruct his face. The scars remained for life. His jawline was permanently distorted, his speech soft and limited. Yet, despite the pain and disfigurement, he bore it with the same quiet endurance that had defined him as a soldier. When reporters later asked him how he endured, his response was as minimal as his camouflage. "I did what I was told as well as I could. No glory, no theatrics, just duty." By the end of the war, He had 542 confirmed kills, the highest sniper kill count in any war in history. And that number only included those verified by witnesses. His actual tally was likely higher. What made this achievement even more staggering was the time frame, fewer than 100 days. That's an average of 5 kills per day, often in sub-zero temperatures, against overwhelming odds, and with a bolt-action rifle without a scope. Military historians later studied his technique with astonishment. His precision defied training manuals. His concealment was near perfect. His discipline unmatched. Even his survival from the devastating wound seemed to mirror the same paradox that defined his life, that a man who had made himself invisible could not be erased so easily. But while the rest of the world began to mythologize him, He had returned to his old rhythm, not as a hero seeking recognition, but as a farmer returning to his fields. He spoke little about the war. When he did, it was factual, never boastful. He kept his medals stored quietly in a drawer, rarely displayed. The only visible trace of his past was his reconstructed face, a reminder of what it cost to become invisible. In military academies around the world, his tactics became study material. His combination of simplicity, patience, and environment-based concealment influenced sniper doctrines across generations. For Finland, he became an enduring symbol, a humble man who had defended a nation through precision and silence. And for the rest of the world, he became something more abstract, a study in what happens when man, nature, and purpose align perfectly. Even the Soviet archives, long silent about their defeats, later acknowledged him. Internal reports describe the psychological toll of fighting an unseen, silent shooter. Commanders admitted that entire battalions hesitated to advance into areas haunted by the White Death. His camouflage had done more than hide him. It had shattered enemy cohesion. It had turned snow itself into a weapon. The war had ended, but the lessons he embodied were only beginning. Militaries worldwide realized that invisibility was no longer fantasy, it was strategy. Heihe's final mission, though unintended, was symbolic. In his moment of greatest vulnerability, his body broken, his legend fading, he still achieved what he had always sought: to disappear. He slipped quietly into recovery, out of the headlines, out of military life, and back into obscurity. Yet his story refused to vanish. It remained whispered in the halls of sniper schools, printed in manuals, and retold wherever soldiers discussed what it meant to be unseen. Invisibility was no longer just about camouflage. It was about identity. And in that paradox, being most remembered for being unseen, Simo Heihe became eternal. The war had ended, but the shadow he cast would stretch across decades. The age of the invisible soldier had begun. The ceasefire of March 13, 1940, marked the end of open combat, but not the end of its consequences. Finland had lost 11% of its territory, including much of Karelia, Heihe's home region. Over 400,000 civilians were displaced, forced to abandon villages, farms, and forests, now ceded to the Soviet Union. But though Finland had been pushed back on the map, its reputation surged forward. In the eyes of the world, this small northern nation had faced a superpower and survived. Its soldiers, armed with little more than skill, endurance, and camouflage, had turned snow into armor. The Finnish army, once considered minor, became a case study in modern asymmetric warfare. Military observers from Germany, Britain, and the United States examined the conflict closely. They wanted to know how a nation so small had inflicted over 120,000 Syria deaths while suffering just over 25,000 of its own. And among the Finnish reports, between the statistics, casualty figures, and tactical analyses, the name Simo Heihe appeared again and again. Not in propaganda, not in self-promotion, simply in record as a man who, for 3 months, defied an empire through the quiet mastery of invisibility. Heihe spent months in recovery, undergoing painful reconstructive surgeries. His lower face was rebuilt piece by piece. His speech was slow and slightly slurred for the rest of his life. Yet, he never complained. When asked later how he felt about his wartime achievements, he replied, almost casually, "I only did what I was told as well as I could." It was the perfect summary of his character: pragmatic, humble, and unshakably Finnish. He was promoted from corporal to second lieutenant directly by Marshal Carl Gustaf Emil Mannerheim, Finland's commander-in-chief, an extraordinary honor for an enlisted man. It was recognition not of his fame, but of his discipline. Even during his long hospital stay, Heihe kept a small notebook by his bed, recording hunting observations, weather patterns, and marksmanship notes. He was, at heart, still a hunter, still a student of the land. In the years immediately following the Winter War, Finland once again found itself entangled in conflict, the Continuation War, 1941-1944, when it allied with Germany against the Soviet Union. By then, Heihe's injuries made combat impossible. He was offered instructor roles, but preferred to remain in the background, contributing quietly to marksmanship training and defense research. He avoided publicity throughout his life. No books, no interviews, no self-promotion. He lived in a small village, farming, hunting, and occasionally participating in shooting competitions, which he continued to win well into his 60s. He often said that his happiest moments were spent in the woods, with the rifle and the snow. While he lived in silence, his story spread noiselessly across borders. Soviet accounts of the Winter War, initially censored, began to emerge in the 1960s. Veterans recalled the fear of moving through forests where you never knew if he was watching. The legend of the White Death became part of Soviet soldier folklore, an unspoken acknowledgement of respect toward an enemy who had fought with impossible precision. Historians from both sides began piecing together his record. They compared field logs, testimonies, and ballistic data. The results confirmed what soldiers on the front had already known: Simo Häyhä was the most effective sniper in human history. Yet to him, that number 542 confirmed kills meant little. He viewed it not as accomplishment, but as duty fulfilled. When asked late in life if he ever felt remorse, Häyhä gave a rare, reflective reply. "I did what I had to do. I defended my country. I never hated anyone." It was not defiance, it was clarity. To Häyhä, killing was never personal. It was necessity, stripped of emotion, guided by discipline. The true weight of his actions, of every invisible shot fired through frozen air, rested not in the numbers, but in what they symbolized. The victory of adaptation over arrogance, and the triumph of silence over strength. But the world was changing. New wars, new weapons, and new technologies were already redefining invisibility. The lessons of Häyhä's camouflage would soon take on forms he could never have imagined: machines, patterns and shadows born from the same principle that once guided his hand in the snow. And that transformation began almost immediately after his story reached the desks of military scientists across the world. In the 1940s, as the Second World War expanded across continents, both Axis and Allied powers integrated camouflage as an official discipline. The Germans developed the SS Lebermuster and splinter patterns, intricate patterns, in browns that broke human silhouettes in forests and fields. The British introduced denizen smocks for paratroopers, the Americans issued frogskin patterns for jungle warfare, and the Soviets mass-produced snow smocks inspired directly by their Finnish adversaries. Every army that faced defeat in Finland had learned a simple truth: visibility kills. Camouflage was no longer an accessory, it was survival. Yet none of these new designs could match the elegance of what Häyhä had shown: the harmony between man and environment. His concealment had no design, no fabric innovation, no laboratory testing. It succeeded because it followed nature's rule: blend by simplicity. What he accomplished with a white sheet and patience would take entire research departments decades to replicate. After World War II, camouflage evolved beyond color. Scientists began experimenting with radar absorption, heat signature suppression, and noise reduction, all modern extensions of Häyhä's principle: to exist without being detected. The same logic that guided him to fill his mouth with snow to hide his breath now guided engineers designing jet aircraft that deflected radar waves. The same instinct that made him pack snow around his muzzle to mask his rifle's smoke informed tank exhaust dampening and muzzle flash suppression. In essence, the philosophy of the White Death became the blueprint for stealth itself. By the 1970s, the idea had expanded from soldiers to machines to aircraft like the Lockheed 117 Nighthawk and later, the B-2 Spirit. Their angular shapes and matte coatings were born from the same goal Häyhä embodied: to strike without being seen. The forest had become the sky, but the principle remained unchanged. Meanwhile, in Finland, Simo Häyhä lived a life as silent as the snow he once lay beneath. He recovered fully enough to return to his village, continue hunting, and even train dogs. He rarely discussed the war. When he did, it was in brief, factual sentences. His home remained modest, his life unadorned. He received letters from military historians and marksmen worldwide, many of whom asked for interviews. He declined most of them. Fame did not interest him. The forest did. In his later years, young Finnish soldiers occasionally visited him for advice. He would listen quietly, then tell them one thing: if you miss once, don't move. Wait, the snow forgives patience. Even in old age, his lessons sounded less like strategy and more like philosophy. He passed away on April 1, 2002, at the age of 96, one of the last living veterans of the Winter War. He had outlived every Soviet officer who once ordered his death. He died peacefully, in the same silence that had defined his life. When the Finnish government held memorial events in his honor, there were no grand speeches, just snow, rifles, and quiet respect. Soldiers placed a white smock and a rifle at the edge of the woods, a symbolic silhouette disappearing into the trees. Modern sniper schools around the world still study his methods. His name appears in U.S. Marine Corps sniper manuals, British Army field guides, and Russian Federation training syllabi. Each credits his record not only for its precision, but for what it revealed: that invisibility is not about equipment, it's about discipline. His simplicity outlived all invention. From forests to future battlefields today, invisibility is being pursued not through cloth or snow, but through technology-adaptive camouflage that changes color, quantum cloaking materials, and digital camouflage that confuses optical sensors. Yet at their core, all of these innovations still chase the lesson learned in Finland in 1940. That true invisibility is not achieved by tricking the eye, but by belonging to the environment so completely that you cease to be separate from it. That was Hayes' genius and his quiet defiance. In a century obsessed with spectacle, he proved that the most unstoppable force on the battlefield is not fury or firepower, but calm precision in silence. As modern soldiers don camouflage patterned by supercomputers and drones sweep the skies with thermovision, one question remains timeless: can technology ever truly replicate what one man, lying alone in the snow, once achieved with nothing but focus and faith in the land? That question is Hayes' final echo, one that lingers far beyond his time. The forest has long since thawed, the rifle's gone cold, the snow melted into rivers. But somewhere, in the quiet lessons of every soldier trained to hide before he fights, the ghost of the White Death still watches unseen and eternal.